morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. Who would have thought that in just a matter of a couple of sessions, we would now find ourselves at day 5 of CISO Forum Canada 2020. Before we begin, I think it is due for us to give a shout out to the organizers and the advisory court. From CyberX to all of the 30 plus advisors from across Canada who have not only provided input, have shared their time, and more importantly, been accessible to the wider cybersecurity community in this time of crisis. I want to thank you for what's been a fabulous 4 days and what promises to be a very exciting day number 5. My name is Abbas Hirji. I lead both the AI Hub as well as the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation at Durham College in the city of Oshawa, and I'm joining you live from the beautiful St. Francis Center here in the town of Ajax. I trust all of you in these very challenging times are keeping safe and healthy, and I welcome you to day 5 and hope that you will enjoy what promises to be an exciting day of learning about topics from threat hunting, but more importantly, learning about applied elements of cybersecurity. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity being applied specifically in communities for research and education, and then specifically in areas where you don't necessarily have access to a lot of the tools. We have speakers coming in from all across Canada, and that will be a perfect way to close the day along with the CISO Awards, after which the Intercontinental CISO Forum begins. Without further ado, I'm going to start talking about what this particular discussion is all about. When, if you can recall, the discussion we had with Eric O'Neill from VMware Carbon Black, the author of Grey Day, and his comments on spyware and espionage. If you rewind back to yesterday and the opening keynote by Sentinel-1, they spoke about this element of threat hunting as a mindset. You need to think about what your environment is, and you need to predict what may happen. I grew up in the Middle East, and a very common line that we heard from in a lot of tribal stories that we heard, especially when communities were preparing for danger or were anticipating war, they would say, we never won a war by telling somebody what to do. We simply told them when to do it. It's all about timing and that mindset. But how do you know when to be looking for things, when to activate certain tools? You all know this very well, that a lot of thinking is done in the world by people with very little capacity, and a lot of decisions get made and timings go awry. In the world of cybersecurity, it's no different from that. When I think about threat hunting, I think about something active. The word threat hunting implies the need to look for something. It implies a hunger to satisfy something. It implies a craving, but it also implies an environment, a wild, wild west, if you will, where there is a method to the madness, but everybody understands that madness differently. It implies tools on top of that. More importantly, threat hunting suggests that it's not about just threat protection. It suggests that the CISOs, the CTOs, the CIOs, the leads of security are almost like commanders-in-chief, preparing their troops for what may come. How do they gather this intelligence? How do they act on it? How do they prepare their teams? What third-party vendors and tools do they use? That's going to be the focus of our discussion today. You heard me say this yesterday. In times of challenge, some people will set up barriers, some people will prepare bridges. Let's talk to our two guests about what kind of bridges they've been creating to share threat intelligence data and where do they see themselves going from there. I'll have my guests introduce themselves, starting with Alex. Alex, your name, your title and organization, and what about threat hunting fascinates you? Alex?
Thank you, Ali. I'm Alexander Poizner, president and one of the founders of Parabellyx Cybersecurity. I've been in cybersecurity for the last 25 years. I know I may not look that old, but unfortunately I am. For me, threat hunting is important because it's really about making sure that you reduce the number of unknown unknowns, the ambiguity that you have in cybersecurity in terms of who is there trying to penetrate your environment and whether they have been successful or not without you noticing.
Okay, and I think that aspect of about knowing the unknown unknowns, this has been a common thread across CISO Forum Canada 2020, but importantly than that, it's about also knowing who to share some of your vulnerabilities with, and whether that comes from a personal posture of where you feel you may have some gaps, or whether that comes from some known realities that you've realized that may not necessarily be things you want to share with other people. How do you share some of the realities when you go through threat hunting? We'll be touching on that quite a bit as we go through this hour-long conversation. Mr. Mark, once again, thank you for all of your time at CISO Forum Canada. This is your third session, and I can tell you that the audience has consistently asked to hear more from you, and I'm going to ask you, just for the sake of our new listeners, we have about 200 plus listeners on right now, that you introduce yourself, the title and the organization, and importantly, tell us about who do you think makes that decision on the threat hunting procedures that a company is going to follow. Mark.
Thank you, Lee. I'm Mark Dillon, the VP of IT at Waterloo North Hydro. We are a utility inside of the many networks of utilities across all of Ontario and all of Canada, and our job is to make sure that the expectation you have that you never think twice about is that when you turn that light switch on, there's light. And if there's not, that's alarming. So there's a very high expectation that we perform so reliable that you just never think we won't work. Cybersecurity is becoming part of that because we're starting to ignite a bunch of intelligence and decision making done by system automation to help make that even more reliable. When I was growing up, you might remember, of you who are as old as I am, growing up in the 80s and 90s, that there would be a power outage for an hour. That would be a normal power outage. Sure, maybe it only happened once or twice a year, but it'd be an hour. Now you have blips, less than 10 seconds. That's because of these automated systems that are making things more reliable. But these automated systems could potentially open up a new attack surface. I first got interested in cybersecurity when I was pretty young, logging onto BBSs, figuring out that some of these protections around the video games that I wanted to play maybe could be broken. It meant that there was a vulnerability, and I found that very fascinating. And I think threat hunting, to an extent, legitimizes that work and makes it no longer in the gray area, but brings that same excitement into your day job. And that's where I think it will start, is actually at the technologist level, and they may be creating the guidelines without permission or knowledge. So we need to start thinking about what do we want them to be doing, and how do we want to direct that work so that we can avoid some bad things from happening and can actually get the right value out of that passion.
Thank you so much for that, because I think it's extremely important that we define threat hunting, but more importantly than that, we also look at the tools and the methodologies that are followed to engage in such practices. Now, I've said this a lot of times that the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed during war, if war ever was to happen. The more prepared you are, the more protected you are. Alex, let's start off with you to talk a little bit about, let's define what we mean by threat hunting, and more importantly, what is it that you're looking for that already may not have been blocked by your firewall, your IDS systems? What exactly are you looking for when you go down this mission of threat hunting? Alex, let's begin with you.
Thanks, Lee. Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, in terms of threat hunting, I think there are a lot of different frameworks that already define it well, saying that it's a proxy of activity, it's a recurring activity. What you're doing is you're trying to find out and identify whoever entered your networks, your systems. So really, yes, it's a recurring task, but as you said before, there is a lot of preparation, right? So it's not just about going and executing the activity itself, but like with the actual hunting, before you embark on the hunt, well, guess what? You're looking at equipment, you're looking at weather, you're looking at researching the spots, lay of the lands, animal habits, and much more. Much the same is happening with the threat hunting. Before you can embark on threat hunting, you need to start with something. You need to start with some kind of information, data, what we call, for example, threat intelligence. We need to know who, why, how. I mean, the tactics, the techniques, the tools. Those are extremely important things. And as you embark down this path, obviously, you will consistently start asking yourself questions. Who am I looking for today? Do I know how they are going to try to get into the environment. I mean, what kind of tools they're going to use? Are they going to try to get through, let's say, an email with a malicious attachment or link? Are they going to get through some kind of business account that has been compromised? What are they going to do? How are they going to establish persistence, meaning that they will have the connection to your environment? How are they going to propagate within your environment? All of those questions are extremely important. And if your security tools haven't detected them, well, the next question that you have to ask, do you have enough data? I mean, one thing is to know about how that threat actor is going to act getting into your environment and within your environment. But another thing is, do you have enough data within your environment to confirm or deny that the threat actor is in your environment? So that's another important aspect of threat hunting. It's really a continuous improvement cycle, right? And as we said with unknown unknowns, well, once I get intelligence on that threat actor, on their methods and means, well, then I'm moving them into kind of unknown known. So now I can begin the threat hunting given that I have enough data.
Yep.
Now, once I've moved through the threat hunting cycle and hopefully I've confirmed that they're not there, guess what? Now I have known that I simply give to my security operations team and say, here, we know that they're not here, but those are things that we need to protect from. So this is where you actually configure your preventive tools for that protection.
Alex, I really like that, because what you've touched upon is this aspect of, hey, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. But this renders a really important question, Mark, and I want to bring this to you, and then we'll go back and forth and enjoy this fireside chat-like environment that we have. And Mark, and this is the aspect of how important is it to be doing this as a CISO, as a lead for IT responsible for information security infrastructure, knowing fully well that you've invested in tools to prevent a lot of the known attacks? How do you manage to do this with your team? But also, how do you manage to ensure that these results get relayed to the vendors that may be providing you with certain endpoint securities, with firewall security implementations that you might have, with other perimeter securities? Why is it important to do this on your own, and how do those results get relayed? Mark.
So I think it's important that you get to a maturity model where you get mature enough, your team gets evolved enough in cyber defense that they are able to consider doing this. This is not something you start with. This is a level of advanced. If you think of a simple example like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have your safety component. Let's call that, make sure all your equipment is not 20 years old and not falling apart. Then you have your next part, which is making sure that your team is informed and that they have the basic tools they need to actually monitor the environment. When you move into the self-actualization section, your team starts to feel comfortable. They start to feel they actually know where all the assets are. They know where they think the threats are. They know how to look. They have a routine. We've made the implicit explicit and visible.
Yep.
Only at this point can you start to say, I've got a surplus of time. I'm going to start looking proactively. Now, I'm not saying don't do that here and there, because some of the things you should probably do is what we might call an adversary simulation, where you pretend to be your enemy and learn about your environment from an external view. You'll be surprised what you do when you do that. If you haven't done that yet, you're probably not ready to start threat hunting.
Yep.
So there's a possibility you could engage some external partners as well. But I always caution over-reliance on that. Think of them as a partner and not the executor, because you don't want to outsource your understanding entirely.
Yep.
And so all that being said, all those caveats, when you get there, it's important to do because you can prevent something. You're not responding anymore. You can get out there ahead of time, and while you're being ready to proactively, you can start to think, I can see how I can prevent this from being effective in the future. And it gives you a level of insight that can maybe start to create more of that surplus time. So you're not always chasing after something historically.
I want to work with that just a little because you've brought up some really important points about the timing of when you begin threat hunting and the maturity model. To our audience, especially the C-suite executives that are there, you know this quite well, but we do have quite a few folks who are director level, who are not necessarily making decisions about when to start a particular process, but are involved in it. One of the fundamental elements that I would add to this is that security doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's a lot of context around it. And what Mark is referring to is really about understanding the context and the environment within which your organization functions. It could be the realities of a political event. It could be the realities of a financial event. It could just be the realities of something else outside of your borders that may be impacting the need to attack something of your ilk. So it's really important to be well read, well informed, but then as well to know your system architecture very well. You know, in some of the exercises that I've been a part of, one of the core things that you see is going through the guts of the whole application. So in some cases, you know, going through an understanding of how the web server communicates with your host server. How exactly are you rendering the application? How are calls being made? How are scripts being optimized? What are the indexes that are in place? All of these areas, once you know the guts very well and you know the context very well, it prepares you to go into that environment with the right tools, but also gets you listening to understand as opposed to listening to simply react. So Mark and Alex, thank you for setting that context. Questions come in, which I'm not sure if I want to take it now, but I think I will, simply because it sets a very good ground level understanding of threat hunting and why it exists as a separate discipline and practice. You know, one of the things that vendors and partners often get accused of is everybody's selling us the same tool to switch off the same light switch. But that's not quite the case. This question, Alex, let's start off with you, and then Mark, I want to get your perspective as well. It's the aspect of how then is threat hunting necessarily technically and practically and operationally different from doing a pen test? Is it nothing but a glorified pen test? Alex, can we start with you?
Well, it's a good question because first of all, pen test it's really about trying methodologically to go and look for specific issues, vulnerabilities, let's say, in the system, and then exploit them and see where it's going to get you. And in most of the situation, pen test that's usually done as a black box where you don't have much information about the system initially. When you are doing threat hunting, it's opposite. First of all, you're not testing your system security. At this point, we assume that you know the lay of the land. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it is fairly hard to outsource threat hunting, as Mark said previously, because you need somebody with intimate knowledge of how your systems works, understanding of architecture, understanding of the applications design, perhaps the design of your security controls. Now, the activity itself, it's more of, I would not afraid to say this, it's a data mining activity, right? You are not proactively testing the defenses. What you're doing, you're going through the data. You're going through the data from the logs, through the data on the systems, through how the systems configure, and you are looking for specific things. You're looking for some kind of indicators of a compromise that would tell you, hey, something bad might have happened. It might be certain suspicious logs around manipulation with identities or certain other suspicious activities of privileged identities. It may be certain suspicious processes running on the system. We've seen a lot of fileless malware where the attacker simply runs a bunch of PowerShells that is really a living of the land attack at this point. So there are a lot of things that you have to look for, but really it's about going through a massive amount of data, and you have to know where to look for and what to look for. As Ali said, that the entire threat hunt begins with the idea that hey, you know what? There is some kind of news event. There might be some indicators that other organizations in your sector, in your geographic area are being attacked. And then you'll start looking at who's trying to attack them. That's usually, in many situations, you are making an assumption. There might be not direct evidence at this point. And then based on that, you're going to look in how those attackers usually conduct their attacks to get into a system and to move through the system. So again, this is all about looking through a lot of data, trying to find a needle in haystack, which is very different from what penetration testing or cyber war game like your red team will do.
Absolutely. I really appreciate what you said and the perspective that you've provided. To our audience, again, this is an emblem for the statement that your view and your shape of the world really depends on the lens that you look at it from. And threat hunting allows you to look at your applications from a very different lens. I want to take that different lens and come back to Mark and set a little bit of more context to this. Thank you to both Mark and Alex for really giving us a good summary overview of the philosophy behind threat hunting and the operational ethos behind it. Let's set some context here. I think this was about a week or so ago that in the UK, the NHS had reported that 1 in 3 cyber crimes that were happening were related to COVID-19. Park that aside, they had another little interesting stat that may not be news to many of you, but it's one to ponder about. And that is, once a vulnerability has been found and a threat actor has entered into your system, it doesn't mean that they'll execute anything right away. Sometimes they live in that system for 50 days, 100 days, 6 months before something actually gets executed on. Think of it this way, and I'll blow a little bit of a weird example, but if someone's gotten into your house, they may not necessarily begin to loot right away. They may hide in a particular unknown area, maybe the attic, maybe someplace that you don't check, and wait for that opportune moment. Threat hunting is not about, let's see where we have gaps or vulnerabilities. It's really about that moment. Something and someone is within our system that shouldn't be there. Mark, that means that once you go down this path of threat hunting, let's say you're taking a look at, as Alex suggested, you're looking at communications going through your email server, or you're looking at something where you are indexing data sets and you're looking at all the queries that are being made and you notice something within that environment. How do you act then, and what's the immediacy with which you need to act once a threat has been detected? Mark.
That's a great question, and I like your example about the house. I know it's a little unnerving, and it's not as practical because someone can't really hide in your house for a year. You'd probably
unless
find
it's
them.
Yours, Mark, because you've got the private jet, you've got the helipad, so it is possible in some. There's always an exception to prove the rule. Sorry, Mark, carry on.
Yeah, no, you're right, of course, but in one of the many houses, right?
Yes.
But the idea is, we talked about on the last session. I mentioned one of the first ransomware that was public, a public sector municipality was Wasaga Beach.
Yep.
And if you look at even their public council report, they were in there for months, if not maybe over a year, they're not sure. And they actually did research and learned how their backups work and learned all their processes prior to executing their attack to make it more effective. During that whole time, you could say, if you were the CISO or the IT manager, whoever there, would say, I can't believe I didn't find it in all that time. And that's sort of because threat hunting perhaps wasn't part of it. And you need to think to yourself, and this is not one thing, by the way, I don't mean to pick on municipalities. The only reason we know about them is because they're public and they have to file public reports. There are hundreds and probably thousands of institutions that just don't have to admit it because they don't have to make a public report on it. So let me give you a practical and simple to understand example of what threat hunting might look like. So the first thing I do, and I would do this with my executive here, is I'd say, don't operate as though people are trying to get in. The assumption you operate on is that they are already in, and they just haven't done anything yet, either because they're waiting or because there's no reason to use it right now. So there's supply chain attacks. There could be stuff in the gear that we ordered, and we're not looking for that. There are pieces of software, there are old systems, there are ex-employees, there are people who just weren't careful. There's all these reasons. So one of the things most IT shops will do, not even security shops, is they monitor stuff. They watch their machines, they look at how they perform, so they can proactively see, is this hard drive going to get full? One of the things that a hard drive does, storage, is input, output operations per second. How many times you write from it and how many times you read from it. And these have a sort of pattern to them. So you're probably already monitoring all of this. This is valuable data. Back to the data mining that Alex talked about is get a profile. Okay, I have 100 desktops. Why are some of them a lot more chatty than others with their hard drives? Is there a reason? Wait, maybe we should look at that. Oh, it's a strange finance application that does a lot of reads or writes. Or maybe it's some nefarious thing doing some data mining or things like that. And that's not exactly what you would think of as a typical security, but it's the type of data you want in your data profile for when you start to do your threat hunting. And once you get down there and realize that this is something you could look at, you might start to think, okay, maybe anomaly detection on my input and output operations on my devices is something I want to add to my dashboard or my portfolio or my insights to help inform, so that if I know a machine has a vulnerability that came out last week and now its disk is a lot more chatty than it used to be, maybe that's something to go hunting about. Maybe that's a potential threat. And back to your last question is, when you find it, what do? Well, it's situational, but typically you want to isolate that machine. You want to look at the damage it may have done. The last thing you want to do is reboot it, because it might have valuable things in RAM. Yep. You want to make sure that you take very care and do what we would call a forensic analysis. And maybe that's when you want to call somebody in.
I want to work with that just a little bit more, because you've made a couple of brilliant points there, included the closing item of when you bring somebody in. I think that's something that we'll probably close the conversation with, but you really emphasized on this aspect, not once, but twice, on you go hunting, you understand your ecosystem. You brought the example of the hard drive, or in my case, when I brought the example of the web server or the database that's hosting your application and running queries. You need to go and look for certain things, and you need to go hunting, which implies that there's a tool set that you use, there's a stack that you use, which requires a certain skill. Another question that's coming, and Alex, we'll start with you and then go back to Mark. Alex, I know when we look at the example of Mark is within an enterprise institution and services that institution alone. You service a whole bunch of clients in various sectors, public, private, small to medium, large, across North America, in fact. What is the tool sets that your team needs, or what is the skill set that you need in order to build a threat hunting team? Is this the environment where ethical hackers live? Is this the environment where certain industry credentials are required? Can you give us a sense of the morphology and the makeup of the team that, as Mark eloquently put, goes out hunting? Alex?
So for me, Ali, a good example of what needs to be in the team, obviously, there are several skills that are extremely important. One is somebody who can actually take the intelligence information, convert it into a meaningful information to look for. That's extremely important. Then there are other skills that are as important. Obviously, somebody with the data analytics skills, that's important. A lot of times, having a good technology IT generalist on a team is great as well, because guess what? To find those small patterns of suspicious behavior in the system, you need to not only understand the security, but you also need to understand how systems work. Like Mark said, how the operating systems work, how your Active Directory perhaps works, how the attackers will try to communicate. So just finding the patterns through network analysis. And then obviously you will need somebody to reconstruct all of this together, because frankly, you cannot just say we had one suspicious activity, and that's something that confirms the hypothesis. Because as we go threat hunting, initially we build the hypothesis. The hypothesis, like Mark said, somebody is in the environment. We think it's that particular actor. We need to confirm that. So you need somebody who can build out timelines, heat maps, things that will actually prove that there is indeed a malicious activity and not a suspicious activity in the organization. In terms of the tools, again, there are multiple tools that are required. Fortunately, even for the companies that do not have much budget, a lot of tools are available for free. One great thing about threat hunting as well as incident response is that the tool sets that are out there that you can use, and those tool sets, you do not necessarily have to pay for them.
Yep.
Now, obviously, we should start with the intelligence. So intelligence, that's where you get to threat feeds. Threat feeds, there are a lot of community threat feeds that are available free. There are obviously a lot of good commercial threat feeds that are available as well. Even if you have a relationship with an anti-malware vendor or EDR vendor, they will have their own threat feeds that will be useful to you as well.
Yeah.
Then obviously you need something to analyze the data. You're not necessarily going to go onto each system and right away. What you're going to do is you will try to find some kind of anomalies in the data. So how do you analyze the data? Obviously, we have multiple ways. We have our traditional SIEMs. Some of the companies started creating data lakes from from security and other logs, which are extremely useful if you have the right skills, if you have the right data science skills to analyze those. Then obviously there are specific tools which we use to basically focus, zoom in on specific systems, how they operate, anything from the in-memory analysis. We may have analysis on the signatures. So those tools are important as well as you go in and try to see whether the suspicious activity is a false positive or indeed this is something that is malicious and needs to investigate further. Again, there are a lot of different scanners that you can use out there. You can construct your own scan patterns via, for example, YAR scripts. So this is, again, an important set of tools. And
Absolutely.
again, like Mark said, forensics. Sometimes we would even go as deep as using forensic tools to confirm something.
Absolutely, and I think that that closing on forensics tools, really that open heart surgery moment, is one that we'll probably talk about. We've got about 20 odd minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get through a couple of the other questions as well. Alex, thank you for that detailed analysis and really drawing the differentiations between threat hunting and pen testing, so on and so forth. And you've brought up a very important point, that is, there's no end to this process. There are only new beginnings. And with that, Mark, I want to weave you back into the conversation. You know this very well, that at the executive table, it's kind of unfair, but you go through years and years and years of research for that one moment where you have 10 minutes to present what the situation is. Now, how then, with all of these analysis that you're doing, you go threat hunting, you go out on a mission, let's say, from a timing perspective, you're engaging in it consistently, let's say 3 times a week as an example, you're gathering lots and lots of information. You have to present it. There's quantitative, there's qualitative. What are some of the tools that you would recommend are best suited, especially for the kind of threats that we're seeing today? You've got your traditional opportunities where you can visualize things through using Splunk, Alienware, but now there's also a heavy demand on elk stack-like tools. What are the best logging and dashboards that you've seen that support threat hunting practices and sharing our findings? Mark?
Sure. So the first thing I'd say is for people who have that burden of being the bridge of communication between the pure business world and the business tech world, and then probably have a bunch of text reporting to them. I fully respect how difficult that position is. You may have arrived in that position as a business person who got into IT, or an IT person who was promoted into business. And both of these paths are very different, and they both have an equal challenge. For technologists to understand the business world while still doing the technology job, and potentially not even rehiring themselves after they were promoted, which is more common than it should be, is just as difficult as a business person who didn't necessarily love all this tech stuff to start out with, but then started to manage it. And they have to figure out how much they can take on faith and how much they have to dive in and understand this whole foreign world that by the time they learn it is already different again.
Yeah.
just like you mentioned. So we would have had traditional tools like Splunk, and now we're doing these other tools, and there's a whole myriad of acronyms and tools. So one of the things I would say is, sure, it's good to have that presentation, but make the data visible in a way that can be consumed by everyone all the time, which gets to the tools you talked about. So some of the basic tools I've used across some of the organizations I've worked with, and one of them that really was a leader in this actually was the city of Oshawa, that did a fantastic presentation at one of the previous municipal presentations. And it was around the implementation that we kind of co-worked with them on, an implementation of a product called Greylog, which is an open source, it has a community version and an enterprise version, essentially does log aggregation using rules, and then creates dashboards based on whatever you want. And it is very complicated, and there's lots of great articles about it, and that is one of the things you'll learn when you get into these tools. One of the things I'd recommend if you wanted to start to think your organization's moving towards something like threat hunting is take a look at some of the more very tactical certifications that you can have your staff work on. So something like Offensive Security's OSCP is a very good certification for learning the actual how to do. And there are other ones that are quite similar. It will introduce them to the tools, some of them being forensics, the basic build of Kali Linux, for example, and the many forks and things that go along with that. They'll learn about things like simple Nmap or OpenVAST, which is the free version of Tenable's Nessus. And another really good one for putting things up is Grafana. Grafana is a very nice tool for the visualization dashboard, but these are skills, and you need to give your people a serious amount of time to learn in whatever way they learn, whether it's they're a passionate home lab person who wants some equipment, or they want half of every Friday to fool around. They need to have some environments they can play on, whether that's in the cloud or in your on-premise stuff. And so the tools that we would use normally is monitoring. We use a fork of Nagios called CheckMK. For log aggregation, we use the Elk Stack Greylog version. We use Grafana to show things to people, and then we have custom web page kiosks and systems and TVs where you can take the idea that when you walk up to the help desk, as simple as that is, you can see their work. It's not that they have 1,000 tickets and secretly you don't know them, why aren't they working on your thing? You walk up there with the impression of the scale of the work, the state of the systems. And the last thing I would say is when you're trying to make this data visible to the business, start small. Maybe measure it towards your KPIs. Create new KPIs that are security relevant, but not too many, maybe one or two, and create them through abstractions that make sense. And so a simple example I would use would be when we're talking about system health and visibility, don't say, the web servers DB is, got slow writes today. Say we have a product, which is our web portal, and today it is green, or it is yellow, it's impaired, or it is down. That's all anyone wants to know. And you want to do the same thing with security. And it's based on trends, it's going to take time, and you're going to get frustrated at the starting. And there's all of those people that I just mentioned, they all have professional versions that'll give you help as well. And there's so many other things I could talk about, but we need time for other questions as well.
Absolutely. And Mark, that's one of the fascinating aspects of always having our audience and your own fan base here at cyberexchange.ca, because you can oscillate really well between the operational, the theoretical aspects of security, but also to the technical elements. And I think that aspect that you brought up, for example, you mentioned Elk Stack, Greylogs, etc. Each of these pieces of software and equipment is a skill set in and of itself, which has to get the CISO and the CIO and the CTO thinking from a budgeting perspective. This is where industry certifications certainly come in, but this is where I'd also encourage you, if you get the chance, to reach out to your academic partners, like in our case, the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation at Durham College, to see what some students at the graduate level might have already been using in those free community versions. These are the opportunities where you create a threat hunting team based on some new talent that's out there, based on some co-ops that may be able to come in and use some of these tools, and importantly, customize them. So Mark, thank you for that context. We've got about 18 more minutes left and a couple of questions. Alex, I'll come back to you, and then we'll go around and see where we land from there. And Alex, this is the question of the topic that we have, and this was provided, by the way, by VMware Carbon Black. I want to thank them again for being a platinum and a premier sponsor of CISO Forum Canada. Their team has been absolutely fantastic, and we've enjoyed all of our engagements with them. And to the audience, please join their group on cyberexchange.ca and take a look at some of the data points that they have there that you could use, and reach out to them if you need a demo or if you need any support from them. Alex, in your own practice, where you're helping different clients, the topic that we're discussing is really new trends and threats. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot now is that COVID-19 specifically has shaped and reshaped the kind of threats that individuals like yourself are beginning to see in the market. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are some of the emerging trends and threats that you're seeing as a result of the pandemic? Alex?
Well, when we're talking about a pandemic, it's really more of the psychological. I mean, when everybody's in the office, or most of the people are in the office, there is that hive mind where people would be, in case of something suspicious, seeking confirmation from coworkers, other people. When people are working from home, they feel like they have to be more independent. So there is less communications going on. And this is something that the attackers are exploiting right now. I mean, from the technology perspective, we've seen most of those methods and tactics before. However, from the psychological aspect of cybersecurity, what we may call social engineering, we see that the attackers are effectively exploiting the communication breakdowns, where people are no longer trying to seek an advice of their coworkers, where they feel like they have to act independently on something, and sometimes in high pressure situations. So that's one of the important things. This is where a lot of companies should be really reviewing their processes, whether those processes still work well in the telecommuting environment. Other thing that I see is now that the people are working remotely, that the attackers are more opportunistic. We've seen a bit more of what we call drive-by attacks, where it's not targeted per se to a specific organization. However, the attacker, for example, would try to compromise, let's say, an advertisement agencies, and try to spread malware and ransomware through malicious advertisement on legit sites.
Yeah.
We've seen this over the last couple of months with few organizations. Again, those cases, this I think can happen to everybody. It's really where the stars were aligned, but we are seeing more and more of this, and that's disturbing. Another thing is we see more fileless malware than ever, meaning that it is hard to detect. It again, once it executes on user machines, and once it establishes the anti-malware bypass, which is one of the technologies that attacker uses initially to kind of get rid of antivirus inspection once it's in the memory. Once those bypasses are established, and once they've escalated privileges on the machine where they've established foothold, it's really hard to detect what they're doing if they are using fileless malware.
Interesting. And I think this aspect of it's really hard to detect what they are doing. I want to focus in on the they. And Mark, I want to bring this conversation to you, because as Alex just pointed out, is that they may be looking at, and we'll unpack what they is, but they may be looking at, for example, distributing malicious malware through legitimate sites. They may be looking at corrupting certain practices and certain routes through which you're rendering services. And this is, standard when you are going to communicate over public IP protocols. But Mark, what is the they when we talk about in-threat hunting? Has, as a result of the pandemic, the nature of the threat, the nature of the gangs that are perpetrating threats, has that changed? Are you finding them now to be more spread across different countries? Are you seeing trends where and I'm not trying to single out any country, but one country may have a group of attackers that are smaller in their groups, but more democratic or more restricted, and then the others might be larger, but more democratic and spread across. What are you seeing in terms of how the threats are roaming in our environments? Mark?
Sure. So gets back to the lenses conversation you had before. And so different attackers see their target through a different lens. They have a different motive. So we have, the standard like 4 or 5 different types of attackers, which I honestly think we're fortunate in that it's not the worst kind that is the biggest actor right now. We've got so let's think of a hospital. Let's say the hospital is the target. So you have a black hat person who basically just wants to get in there, see if they can, and make a name for themselves. It's about ego, it's about prestige within the hacker community. You have the white hat hacker actually fix the problem and then send the sysadmin, hey, I fixed this for you. This is the person who eventually becomes the professional.
Yep.
You have your financially motivated attackers, which is this is what most of what we're seeing right now is, which means that there is an understandable motive that has a damaging effect for sure, but it is not for the purpose of doing damage, it's for the purpose of profit. And then you have your ideological motivated attacks. Those are, I think, the most dangerous because they are after doing damage for damage's sake.
Yep.
So maybe someone unlocks the hospital door to see if they can. Maybe the white hat hacker patches the way that they got back in there. And maybe the profit motivated person does a ransomware attack on their database. But the ideological person changes medication ID numbers. So patients are administered the wrong thing and they do it to cause harm.
Yep.
What we're seeing right now is automation of the profit motivated one at a huge scale, taking advantage of poorly implemented cloud as many organizations rush to use it for the first time ever so that their teleworkers, majority of their workforce instead. You see things as trivial as Zoom bombing, which is really just improper administration of your Zoom call being represented as hacking. But the real hacking is some default setting and someone can get in and own the data of your organization, can exfiltrate it and sell it, or make it so you can't get it so that you have to pay them for access for it. And to defend against this, you also need to employ your own automation because the staggering amount of attempts to break down your door are getting to be nearly immeasurable, and you almost can't even notice 99% of them.
And not noticing 99% of it brings me to a question which I'll reshape just a little bit. And again, thank you, Mark, for pointing out about, when I asked specifically about how the pandemic is reshaping threat actors and this aspect of how quickly hospitals have had to move to digitized environments. About 2 days ago, I had the fortune of moderating a session on telemedicine and some of the fears that security personnel have with going down that route. And one of the main things that we heard from UHN, from Sick Kids Hospital, from Blue Cross as well, was this element of the speed at which innovation has been required and requested, and how that can ultimately, instead of taking you forward, take you pretty much back to a place where it's very difficult to render basic services as well, primarily because patient data gets corrupted with. So Mark, thank you for re-emphasizing that. And to our audience, again, there's a lot of literature on cyberexchange.ca about healthcare specific attacks, and there are a lot of individuals on cyberexchange.ca that I recommend that if you're having some concerns, if you're running a particular service, especially if you're dealing with medical records, these are some really interesting people to connect with and build community around. And I believe in 2021 there is a healthcare track to the cybersecurity conferences being planned by CyberX, so keep an eye out for that. We've got about 7 more minutes, and Alex, I want to come to you with this aspect of lenses that Mark very carefully brought up. And this was the element of, he brought up that example of somebody on the outside wants to see if they can open up the hospital door. We always talk about the outside coming inside, but what about the inside doing something within the inside? And what I mean by that is threat hunting and internal stakeholders, threat hunting and internally motivated attacks. How can we use our threat hunting modeling to see if there are any actors that are inside the organization itself? Alex, we'll start with you and close with Mark.
Great question. I mean, insider threat is really a hot topic right now for 2 reasons. One is obviously there are motivated insiders that would want to do something. Either they are really disgruntled employees, or they're trying to leave with some intellectual property. Not sure which one is more dangerous. There is also sometimes an aspect of somebody being financially motivated to help outsider. I mean, we've all read the case about one of the Russian malware groups trying to get to launch a ransomware attack on Tesla by actually soliciting one of the employees and offering a fairly large amount of money. In terms of how you would go around looking for insider threat through threat hunting, again, this is where you are looking for suspicious activity patterns. I mean, this may be somebody accessing certain things that they shouldn't, or there is a large amount of data being moved around the company by a specific user. Again, in many organizations, it may get even more complicated than that, because if you are a malicious insider that knows your way around technology well, you are going to cover your tracks, and you probably can do more than an external attacker that tries to not to get caught. I mean, you may be a bit more free in terms of the tools that you're going to use. You may be you may have an easier time of getting hold of privileged accounts. So those are the things that you probably, as a threat hunter, would want to look for initially. But obviously, in many situations, it's the exfiltration, the data exfiltration attempt that gets noticed. Unfortunately, at this point, sometimes it's too late.
Absolutely. And I think, like I said at the very start, it's not about how or what we're going to do to win the war or the battle. It's when we are going to do it. Time and timing, such an important aspect of the threat hunting process. We have one more question, and Mark, I'll bring that to you before we summarize. And that is a question of, can threat hunting go wrong? And if I can add my 2 rupees of thought to the table, I don't necessarily think that it can go wrong. I think it can be begun completely wrong, or it be constructed as a practice wrongly, but not necessarily go wrong at the moment. Mark, can you help shed some light on, can threat hunting actually go wrong, or is it conceived of wrongly, which makes the whole process useless? Mark?
So I think, to your thoughts, the first, I think there's 2 ways it can go wrong. The first way it can go wrong is just as you alluded, and just as I said might happen. The passionate people closest to the technology, with the closest amount of understanding about it, may start to do it because it's actually pretty cool to do it, and it feels good, and it ignites that maybe reason why you first got interested in technology, and that's curiosity. But without direction, they may produce no value. They may accidentally do small amounts of damage, cause system outages. They may come to wrong conclusions and create entire technology stacks that are unnecessary. And that can happen if there's not investment from a business perspective, if there's not direction or expectations. And that's one way in which it can go wrong. The other way it can go wrong is, depending on what the business wants to do here and what they mean by threat hunting, you can create a sort of digital police state where everything is monitored and broadcast and known, and people are now inside of a culture where creativity is stunted for fear of reprisal over, like Alex said, those hackers have some tools that professional institutions may decide we're not going to use. At the beginning of COVID-19, because of some bad press, Zoom, lots of places were not using Zoom. Yeah. And so that's a tool that an institution decided was bad. And the same thing can happen with cybersecurity tools. Absolutely. And the same thing can happen with productivity tools. So that's where I think potentially threat hunting could have a negative impact on your business's productivity.
Thank you for that, Mark. Alex, I'll actually give you closing comments. You got 30 seconds. If a company, and I'll read the question directly, if a company wants to engage in its own threat hunting practices, what are some best practices around setting up a sandbox to train themselves on how to engage in threat hunting? A quick 30 seconds, over to you, Alex.
Well, it's really about making sure that you have something that is where you collect enough data, where you have enough access to it, and then basically, I would say, go at it as a red and blue team. Only do not try to detect things in the real time.
Yep.
Have somebody go in, compromise it with specific tools, and then have a threat hunter team go and try to find certain indicators of compromise. That's, I think, the best exercise someone can do if they want to try threat hunting. It also will show you some blind spots. I mean, maybe you're not getting enough data, or maybe you don't have the right tools. So again, that's a good self-check.
Yep. And I think that that element, and I have to throw it in. I know that I have quite a few folks that I know watching. I've been known to throw in a lot of Netflix references. Then, you know what, if I can, then Sacha Baron Cohen always says, right, check yourself before you wreck yourself. I think what you've heard there, right there, is that you need to have those right sandboxes in order to check your environments, the right tools. But I think this is where an individual like an Alex, this is when I spoke about earlier on about the aspect of, do you do this independently or do you bring in someone to assist? Knowing this tool stack, but knowing the technical stack and the talent stack that you have within your environment is extremely important. And creating, like Mark said, these kind of relationships between, you know, different academic bodies, between different students that may be out there, between enthusiasts. This is where stuff like Global Cyber Olympics, collegiate penetration testing competition, this is why, especially I know we have about 50 students that were granted access to this conference. This is why these competitions are important, because folks like Mark, folks like Alex are watching to see how are people thinking differently about the tools that we've been using in one particular way. Can it be used in another? You know, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? How can we, through you, look at things differently? With that, I want to thank Mark, I want to thank Alex for their time, and to our audience, I want to remind you is that what you've heard today is the reality is that the threat landscape is always changing, but COVID-19 specifically has created very specific acute threats. If there are three things I would ask you to consider, and is number one, think about the nature of how the gangs of threat actors are now organized. Number two, think a little bit more about how easy it is now to access some of those lesser used tools than before. A good example that Mark brought up was the aspect of Zoom. We were using it, took it for granted, and now we're using it a lot more and haven't looked at the controls that are in place. And number three is data. That example that both Mark and Alex brought up about a threat actor manipulating data sets and having those right controls in place to see for those anomalies. These are the ways in which we're seeing new attacks and threats emerge, and our threat hunting practices are meant to essentially understand what's going on within our environment, assuming, not that somebody may get in, assuming that they're already in there. Now, I've always said this to my students, and I'll say it again here. You know, that journey to that stage of success is marked with 1,000 and more steps, and I want to thank Mark and Alex for showing us a couple of those steps and reminding us we have a long way to continuously go and to continuously improve. There's going to be a break for half an hour, and then the next session will begin. I'm going to take your leave, asking both Mark and Alex to stay on so we can debrief for 20 seconds. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference, CISO Forum Canada 2020.